Recording. Okay, there we go. Okay, so would anyone who volunteered like to tell us where we, essentially what we know about Bacon so far? What's your impression of Bacon and his project so far?
I feel like so far Bacon has been talking about how he believes that the human mind has its own capabilities, but we're not giving it its power or its attention, so it's still underestimated of what we can reach through science.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good start. You started to feel hopefully that you have some feeling for Bacon's world, his worldview, how he understands. I mean, we'll get in a bit more detail about how he understands science and the method of induction, but how he works and how he kind of crafts his rhetoric. He's very attentive. You can kind of see why people thought he might have been Shakespeare or someone, because he's very literary, kind of in the way he formulates his ideas, and he does them. He's quite a good. He's a kind of a strange propagandist in a way. Like he knows that ideas need to be clothed in images and symbols in order to be remembered and to have an impact. Now, that's not really true, but he thought it was, and that's certainly part of like the kind of idea of propaganda: make things memorable, associate them with things. So he's borrowing all kinds of popular images from the day, like Columbus. He's not only going to use that as the kind of gateway to his idea, but also what's nice about these symbols, or what's powerful about these symbols, is something like Columbus. People are living in that time. They may not even be explicitly aware of all the different associations that Columbus has for them. And Bacon, by adopting that, is just able to, even without stating that significance, he's able to borrow and draw on it to fuel his own kind of project. Hadi could have gone a little further there and say, well, we can see that Bacon is making such a literary, rhetorical, but also political case for the importance of science, right? And he's not only arguing for a new science. He starts, and we spent most of our time, and we will spend more time today, going through all of his reasons for saying that the old science is not serving its purpose. We already saw a couple of indications of that. This image of Scylla, this queen, this monster that is on one hand looks like a beautiful virgin, and on the other hand has scrappy dogs, surrounding it. That when you approach, what he's arguing in all of these cases, you'll see, is that, and that's why he picks the image of a woman, of course, is that science is supposed to be, according to his estimation, his worldview, the one purpose of science is to be fruitful, is to produce things. It's not to know. This is a big controversy in the history of the West, is whether human beings, the highest role of human beings is to do things or to know things. Which one is it? So you say this is even true in religions, right? So for instance, the Catholic model of happiness was being able to contemplate God, right? Contemplate. This goes back to Plato even, right? The contemplation of the ideas. Simply, it's like the goal of your life is to see something and to love it. That's one model. There's this other model that says, no, the goal of life is not to know anything necessarily, but to do something, to be an active person, to maybe help other people. So Protestantism was always not very interested in this contemplative ideal, right? Because they had this very active idea of serving God and so on, and working hard and these kinds of things. This is not just between Protestant and Catholicism. This is just a constant back and forth about what, I mean, Aristotle had the same thing. He himself wasn't clear on whether the highest form of life was philosophy, which contemplates, or politics, which acts in the world. So this kind of dichotomy or this argument goes around and around. And as we'll see, it's right here in this block of text. Descartes will have a very contemplative notion of what is good. To be good is to have a certain kind of knowledge of things. And maybe it might entail doing things, but doing those things depends upon having the knowledge. And in the most extreme cases, as in, say, Socrates, or say in, there was a philosopher named Christian Wolff who was a Cartesian, or Spinoza who was a Cartesian, to know, if you know, then you automatically will do the things you're supposed to do, right? So knowledge leads the way, and sometimes action even follows as a necessary consequence. They say, if you're not a good person, that's because you don't know what is good. If you knew what is good, you would not be able to be a bad person. Knowledge would determine that. Bacon is not like that at all. Right? He doesn't promise us any knowledge at any point, right? No ultimate knowledge, no perfect knowledge. Everything is determined by the fruits, the things you can produce with what you think that you know. And so this is enough for him when he's diagnosing the problems of past science, is they haven't made progress, right? That's actually a fairly new idea. The idea that knowledge and science should progress, that it's essential to it. That was certainly not a part of the medieval, I mean, you might discover new things, but the idea that science itself consists and it should be measured by its progress, it's moving beyond the ancients and so on. That's something that the Bacon is trying to make an everyday idea, but was not an everyday idea. Before it's just
Professor,
yeah, Adi?
Does Bacon think that because he believes that men do not want to progress with science, or because they think they can't progress with science?
I think, well, the reason, well, both. Well, and one of his arguments is because they don't try to, they're not going to. This is why you have to be bold, and you have to want it, and you have to kind of be a jerk, as I said before. You have to want it, or it's not going to happen. And you have to adopt the kind of attitude necessary to progress before you will ever progress. So notice that science, this is a bit of an odd way to think about it. Science depends upon taking a certain kind of an attitude. That's part of being scientific. But why did people not do that? It's very hard for us to imagine the past, as you know. People lived in a very, very different time. And now we accept, economies and whatever. They're all about growing and expanding. And this university itself, we're in trouble now as a university, because for the last 10 years, the vision was to grow this university to be enormous, to eventually have, 10, 12, 14,000 students going to AUB. And that was the vision of presidents and provosts, and because bigger is better, is more money, is, this is how we think in the modern world. Becoming smaller, that's failure, right? Or even staying the same, that's failure. All economies have to expand every year. Everyone has to buy more products from Walmart and Amazon and whatever. And if the company doesn't grow, then it's failing, right? This is our modern view of things, and science is the same way we think about everything. But this is not any worldview that the moderns or the ancients ever had. They usually would have had, if they had any strong views on this fact, it would be the opposite, right? It would be that things were once better and everything has gotten worse. It's backwards. the things are not progressing now doesn't, they shouldn't be. They should be trying to get back to where they once were. So it's not really a progression, but this kind of going back, a recovery. We once understood Aristotle. Now let's get back, let's try to discover what he really meant. The Bible was once revealed. The Quran was once revealed, right? That person knew what it meant. Now we've got to do all this interpretation to figure it out again, right? And get back to just the basis. And the idea of expanding and growing means coming up with things that are new. And people generally didn't want new things, because the people who wanted anything that mattered was the people who were in charge. And all that new things could do is destabilize, right? The only things they possibly wanted that were new were some forms of technology with which they could defeat their military rivals or something like this, right? But beyond that, anything new was a source of destabilization, right? People were always fighting. Think of a world in which everybody is just fighting to have what they have at that moment. It's always about retaining what you have, because it's always going to be, there's so many threats in life, plagues, wars, so on, that it's just about trying not to live in a world that is much, much worse than it was yesterday, right? So it's a struggle. You say when life is a struggle to maintain what it is, the idea of growing and expanding as this kind of great ideal is not what you would have. And that shows to a certain extent Bacon's living in a world, particularly as a wealthy, politician, in some of the wealthiest countries in Europe at the time, right? That are wealthy because of the wealth that they're drawing from North America and South America, that he can now talk about growing, right? If your economy is poor, you're not going to ever convince a king to create a whole institution and devote money and wealth to expanding the sciences, right? So to a certain extent, what Bacon is arguing is made possible by some of the political, economic, and so on developments in the period that he's working as well, right? Which weren't possible in the past and weren't found in the past. Okay, good.
Doctor, I just have
go ahead.
To ask about this particular idea. Because religious mentalities were dominant at the time, couldn't it be that science was also deemed unquestionable? And that's why everyone rejected any new advancements to science?
So yes, and you might say this, which is part of what I was saying, that the whole culture wasn't a culture of going forward or of questioning, right? The idea that I was playing out in terms of like expanding and being creative and so on is just as much an aspect that is relevant to science and economy as it is to, as Akasha points out, to religion, right? That's why I mentioned biblical texts and so on. The culture, the question is, these things get borrowed. They go across all domains. Today, there are lots of people who are religious that have what they call progressive religious views, right? And they think of in a kind of intellectual or religious analogy to our expanding economy, right? We have to move forward in the way we look at the world and expand our minds and so on and so forth. So insofar as the medieval and in a different way, the ancient period took religion absolutely as unquestionable, that kind of culture of the unquestionability of authority would have also applied to Aristotle as the church, scientist and philosopher. I don't know if some of you know this, if you study medieval philosophy, you'll run into this funny thing where, so they loved, the main form of medieval philosophy texts was the commentary. So you didn't write a book, you, for the most part, what you did was you wrote a book about a book. You commented on another book. Or sometimes there was these list of things called the sentences. These are statements that someone wrote out way back, who knows when, that are religious statements. And philosophers all just commented on those sentences. So every philosopher from the medieval period has a commentary on so-and-so's sentences. That sounds like a really boring way to do philosophy, but you see how it's always tied to an original source and the interpretation of that original source, even if that original source wasn't Aristotle. If you look at the majority of works of St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, perhaps the most important medieval philosopher, it's the commentary on Aristotle's politics, the commentary on Aristotle's physics, the commentary on their commentary. He just wrote commentaries on everything Aristotle did. And for the most part, what those do is they start and they say, Aristotle says this, but they don't say Aristotle, and this is why I brought it up. They say, the philosopher says, because Aristotle was referred to as the philosopher. There were no more philosophers. There was just Aristotle, the philosopher. So you can see how this kind of authority within the way the church spoke even about philosophy, right? Just as you say the one God, there was the one philosopher, Aristotle. And then what did they do? So they'd say Aquinas, who is, the top dog at the time, he would say, the philosopher says, and then he would say, but this doesn't seem to be true. And under it, he would say, because St. Augustine says, and then he would quote St. Augustine saying something that sounds like it disagrees with Aristotle. And then he would say, Boethius says, and he would quote all these authorities that seem to say something different in Aristotle. And then he would say, but it seems Aristotle is true. And then he would quote a bunch of authorities that says that seem to agree with Aristotle. And he would say, but I say, and then he would always show that they're all correct. That the contradiction between Aristotle and the other authorities was always a misunderstanding, right? And they were all in some sense true. If you understand it in this way, then Augustine is right. If you understand it this way, and all those true ways are somehow reflections of what Aristotle really meant, right? So this is how far it kind of goes. If you want to do philosophy in the philosophy department today, and we follow that model, you would simply be spending all of your time memorizing what other people said, and then collecting it together around certain questions and trying to work out how they're all right? And sometimes that required that still led to originality, of course, because they weren't all agreeing with each other. That's nonsense. So you have to come up with some pretty crazy theories sometimes to argue that they're all saying the same thing, right? You have to develop a theory that can accommodate all these very diverse views on something and somehow integrate them into one. So there was a lot of, but it wasn't intentional creativity. It was explicitly presented as not creative, because it basically said, here's what Aristotle was really saying, and this is why, when we properly understand Aristotle, all these things agree with him. So anyways, so we've already seen two problems that he identifies with. So we're going back to the text here. Unless there are other questions, you can interrupt me. He's two major things and these both. Well, the first one was this notion of the sciences as they exist are barren and don't produce any fruits. They only produce controversies. The second was that there's no actual good attempt to collect the knowledge of the past. And I said, this might seem like he's doing something similar, like Aquinas was, collecting what people said of the past, but that's not how he thinks of it. He thinks of it as treating people of the past as sources of empirical information or of real world experience. So the way he would still wants us to read Aristotle and see what Aristotle knew, but not to become obsessed with the interpretation of Aristotelian texts. And if we wondered whether Aristotle was right, the key wasn't to go more deeply into Aristotle, but to simply carry out a test or maybe consult our own experience or consult other authors, right? So he wants us to use, and this is, I said, part of a larger project, which is making society at large a source of information for the sciences. So just as you would call on a engineer or a miner or a metallurgist to ask them questions about, machines, things under the earth and how metals mix and what they form, in order to form and perfect your scientific theories about these things. So also you might read other authors of the past, right? But largely that is, not going to be the large part of science. That's something that he projects we should do and be done with. Have a good catalog of everything that has been actually discovered in the past. Then he goes on and to say this is necessary because those things of the past, most of them are actually lost. So he's saying, those of you who stick to the past, don't even really stick to the past. Because you actually only retain, culture only retains. He makes this a larger issue about how human knowledge is passed along. Knowledge is only passed along in the following way. If it's complicated and difficult, it vanishes quickly from the face of knowledge. If it's easy to remember, if it's a platitude, if it reflects human prejudice, then it's almost impossible to get rid of. It stays forward. So he says, it's like, one example, I don't know if he gives it here yet, time is like a river. Light things that are inconsequential, easily flow down the river of time to us. But anything that's heavy and difficult, and perhaps therefore true, gets lost. Right? This is actually a great piece of wisdom beyond Bacon. It's true in your education, and these kinds. I've said this before. Like, teachers skip the hard parts. They teach you the easy simplifications that are often false, because those things are easier to teach, right? If you now pay attention to the US presidential elections or any kind of politics, the majority of people justify their opinions by platitudes, right? Like all him, I have family, in the United States, and so I see these things as well, and I'm sure you all do too, or know people. And the common response from someone who wants to vote for Donald Trump when you say, but look, he lies, is they say, well, everybody lies, right? These kinds of platitudes, they form people's ways of thinking about the world. And no matter how you might like to disprove it, you can't, because it's such a bland generality, right? What are you going to argue against them that no, other people don't lie? You're not going to argue that. But the difficult point is that not all lying is the same, and actually thinking about it and understanding it, and then lie, right? And understanding there is subtlety and complexity. But that's the difficult thing that the majority of people, for some reason, don't do. Same thing with knowledge. If it seems to agree with people's personal experience, then it seems to be absorbed into the world, right? And become part of people's worldviews, whether it's true or not. And in fact, you might say, and this is kind of Bacon's ideas, that whether that happens has nothing to do with the truth. That's about human nature and what humans want to be true and our prejudices. That's what makes those things stick. And why does that particular idea that everybody lies, why does that stick so well in certain areas of, for instance, the United States? Because they see that as an extension of the religious idea, because they're all very, it's very Christian, that all human beings are sinners and so on and so forth. And so Donald Trump too is a sinner, but who are you to say otherwise, right? This is the next step when you get into the argument with them. How can you judge him? Say, well, I don't know, I think I can. but um, there's, it's not just that that's an easy thing to think, but that kind of conforms with other things that they think. It also conforms with what they already want, which is to stick with their particular political outlook, right? So I'm just, that's just a topical example, but this is this idea that Bacon has right here in the text. Time preserves only bland generalities. Human beings, in fact, human beings are rather dim human things. Even the smartest people are not really all that bright, right? Unfortunately, we learn this. They're just human, as we say. They make errors. We like to put them on pedestals as if they're perfect, because that motivates us and inspires us. But the fact is, human nature is lazy and tends to oversimplify everything, right? And that is just one of the facts of time and the way time passes and the way knowledge falls. The better the knowledge is, the more true it is, perhaps the more likely it is to disappear with time. And so this is another reason why we need to do some excavation of what was known in the past. So he says, this then, more or less, is the condition of the traditional and received kinds of learning. Barren of results, full of questions, slow and feeble in improvement, claiming perfection in the whole but very imperfect in the parts, popular in choice and suspect to the authors themselves. So popular in choice, so well regarded in the public, but the people who actually are part of the sciences are suspicious of them, right? That's why they're involved in these controversies and are always disagreeing. And this actually is a bit of a reflection of think of Copernicus's own point, right? There's more or less agreement in the sciences, people believed, but he says, look under the hood, you know. No one agrees on the real details. And even though he is would have, before he wrote his book, been thought of one of the great astronomers, and if you asked anyone in the street, what do the great astronomers say? They would say, well, the Earth is in the center, and so on and so forth, right? And he was deeply suspicious of his own science. This is the current state. And so the authors themselves who write the books are less confident in it than the public that receives the books. That's also always true of science. Because no one likes to, it's not a good look for you to publish your scientific results and say, I kind of think they might be false, right? I'm not so certain. That's not a, but that's true, right? If you ask anyone, this is why we live a little bit in a new world for you guys, because now for the first time you can have people who were even 30 years ago were authorities you would never hear from in the sciences and other things. Now they show up on YouTube, you know, just saying like, I don't really know if this is true or not, but it's the best I can do. And, you know, you get the kind of real human side and the uncertainty that goes, that is part and parcel of doing, you know, even fundamental science. And it's a bit disturbing, right? You can watch, I don't know if you've done this, but you can look up, you know, the other day I watched 6 hours, a group of philosophers and scientists talking about the big questions, right? What is consciousness? What is da-da-da? Not these guys who make money on YouTube by doing it, but like the world authorities who have written all the books on it. And it's like, when you're done, you think, my goodness, they don't know any more than I do. This is a problem, right? They know a lot of details and facts, but when it comes down to the basic big questions, they're like, what's before the Big Bang? Who knows? Will we ever know? No idea, whatever. Is there a God? Maybe, maybe not. What is consciousness? I don't know. You know, the guy who wrote the book called Consciousness Explained is like, I don't really, you know, that's the mystery. There is a book called Consciousness Explained, by the way. It's a real person I'm referring to. So All of this is wrapped up and presented in a variety of devices, like in books and so on, right? Now he moves on to say, so that's kind of a summary of what came before. I said there's this point that we have to be bold and we have to disrespect the authorities. And he even makes this argument here. He says, for you can hardly admire an author and at the same time go beyond him. It is like water, it ascends no higher than its starting point. I don't know if any of you make this your motto in life, your academic life. It's a bit disturbing in a way, isn't it? This idea?
It's just demotivating to know that there's a certain limit that you won't rise above. So that's why we
If you
try to
admire
ignore.
anyone. That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. So you have, I mean, to me, let me know what you think here, but it seems to tell me a little bit about Bacon himself, his own worldview, his own attitude, and also maybe that's a reflection of the attitude of the time, is that knowledge, respect seems to be inseparable from granting authority. He's assuming these two things are the same. You can't respect or admire an author without and go beyond them. To go beyond them, to say, you couldn't say like, I'm going to take Einstein's theory and my plan is to improve it by integrating it with quantum theory, right? See, you can't do that and admire Einstein. That seems to mean that to admire him, the meaning of admiring and another person necessarily entails not challenging anything that they say.
But isn't it not, no, he's not challenging him. He's more like improving to what he put.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's how we think now. But again, to say we're learning something about that for Bacon, if you were thinking about an Einstein, that he would think that if you're trying to improve someone's theory, that isn't a challenge to their theory. Because everyone presented their theories as the final word, as the authority at the time, right? So no one, it wasn't part of, you don't find this as part of the rhetoric of science of, oh, here I just made a beginning, let others go beyond me, right? It's no, here is the book on this thing, it's done, right? This is how they approached books. I think that that's very revealing, right? To us, this doesn't even make sense. I can admire people and part of going, we even say like there's this part of rhetoric that we adopt even in academics and so on, like, you could do me the best honor by engaging with my ideas and criticizing me and so on, right? Like it's better to be criticized than to be ignored. But people don't always feel that way, even now, right? I mean, that's our ideal. But there are a lot of professors. You'll experience this probably in your own life. There's some professors that are just fine with being criticized, and there are others that if you criticize them at all, they go after you. I know graduate students who have later found out that professors they challenged wrote to future advisors and job people saying, don't hire them, they're bad people. You're like, but why? Because they challenged them and disrespected their authority. I know half a dozen cases where this has happened, right? Not at AUB, so not giving any names, but often this happens this is one of the fears, be careful out there, of being attracted to the most successful people. Because sometimes the most successful people in the sciences turn out to be the oddest and most idiosyncratic, and sometimes the most self-important people in the field. And they can't stand being questioned or criticized at all, right? But this, at least we have the ideal now that this is not the case. And so this shouldn't make sense to us, though it does, right? When you even in the classroom, you know there are limits to what you can say before your professor is going to get angry, right? You can question them some, but there's a limit to it, right? That's always a tricky thing, right? Especially when you have a particularly bold student, because I want to encourage them, but I got to teach too, right? There's a balance there, and there is good criticism and there's bad criticism, right? There's disruptive criticism and there's constructive criticism. But anyways, a very difficult and a very interesting point that still holds true, although it feels like it shouldn't. We understand it. So he's encouraging us to not admire the people of the past and so on. You'll see he doesn't even obey that himself. He does admire Aristotle. He does admire, and he says these kinds of things at various times. It's kind of given, right? Aristotle did so much. If you did philosophy, you're doing something that is still 85% Aristotelian at the time, no matter what. So no matter how bold you think you're being, you're not. You're improving in some way. And Bacon was aware of this, but that's not so much his concern what the truth is about this. It's about the rhetoric. It's about the way to motivate people. As we said, this is kind of like scientific propaganda, right? We have to adopt this attitude of bold, irreverent people to make science progress. So here he moves a little bit, gives some further diagnosis, and now he's turning to actually to methodology, right? To the theory of how we should conduct the sciences. And he's saying no one in the past has done exactly what he proposes to do, right? He says there has been no one who has spent an adequate amount of time on things themselves and on experience. So he's not saying no one spent time on things themselves and experience, but they never spent adequate time. This is one of the easy mistakes to make about Bacon is to think, and it's kind of deflating when you realize it's not true. He doesn't claim to be doing anything completely original, even in science. Like induction, everyone has been doing it. What he's doing original is not some specific thing. It's the focal point of his work is what's original, right? The originality is, so it's all about degree and not about the kind of thing you do. The problem was other people did induction, but they didn't do enough. They spent 90% of their time discussing Aristotle and probably 8% of their time doing something else and 2% of the time doing experiments, right? And he wants science to focus on and develop that dimension, right, of things. So just finally spend an adequate time is pretty much all the time, but not all of it. And some, again, who have committed themselves to the waves of experience. So these are the other people called the empiricists, right? So some spend no time on experience or very little. Others commit themselves to the waves of experience, making themselves almost mechanics, still practice a kind of aimless investigation in experience itself, since even they do not work by fixed rules. This shows that the main point for Bacon is not empirical experience. You can even have tons of experience, and experiments are only slightly more regulated experiences. Experiment and experience come from the same root words. And in a lot of European languages, they're indistinguishable. The same word is essentially used for a kind of experience and experiment, right? What is an experiment? It's just experiencing the world in a certain more focused way, right? With certain questions in mind. So it's not experience by itself. It's all about these fixed rules. It's the rules that are important. The rules according to which you aim your investigations and experience, right? This is about developing the instrument of science by developing not just looking at more things. You know, some of you, were any of you maybe like amateur chemists as children? I was. You know, you like mix things together and see what happens. Sometimes it works out well, sometimes it works out badly. Maybe your parents encourage this, you know, like, oh, they're doing science, right? Mixing bath soap with, you know, other things or whatever. Did you discover anything? Even if you found something odd happened, and I occasionally did, and I'm sure you did too, sometimes dangerous things happen, but you didn't really know what you mixed together in the end. You probably couldn't repeat it. And even if you could repeat it, you weren't able to really do anything with it. You were having lots of experiences that were unusual. You were doing something that looks like science, but you missed, for Bacon, the essential part of science, which is the controlled way in which you put things together. You don't put things together because they're fun colors, and that would be nice to mix them. You put them together because you already have a theory that says this chemical contains a certain molecule that should, you know, disassociate a certain part and combine with another thing, and I should get this reaction. And then you mix the two things to see if the reaction occurs, and so on and so forth, right? So you've got a plan. It's a plan designed experience that is designed such that, and you don't just design the experience, you design the experience with the idea that something should happen such that if it happens in one way, then I answer one question, right? I got my answer to the question. And if it happens the other way, then I know that some other answer is the answer to the question, right? So you formulate it so that Bacon sometimes calls these crucial experiments, because they don't just, they're not just any kind of experiments. They're experiments that are specifically designed to determine yes or no on something, right? So they're crucial. They make a decision. They help us in knowledge make a decision between two things. In most of them, in fact, most of them have set themselves some petty tasks, these empiricists, thinking it is a great achievement to make a single discovery, a design as inept as it is immodest. It is impossible to make a thorough and successful inquiry into the nature of things in the thing itself. After a tedious variety of experiments, he finds no end, but only further lines of investigation. Then again, one should particularly notice that every effort expended on experience right from the beginning has sought to obtain certain specific results and to get them fast and directly. So science should be not directed at specific results. Now we should design it. This is a bit of a subtle point, right? We judge science by its results, but scientific method and induction and so on should not be directed to specific results, but to the understanding of nature itself. So think of like this, like if Bacon, or say Copernicus, since he was more of a real scientist, if his initial goal had been to develop an iPhone, right? Like, he never would have gotten anywhere. There's no way to get to that specific. Nature is too complicated to with that one goal in mind, design all the possible experiments you would need to develop all the scientific knowledge to eventually achieve that one result. So science, and of course he would be thinking about one of the major things that people would be using science for here in this period is for engineering purposes, right? Like a king would hire you. And so this, you say, this is also advice to the governmental agencies, right? Saying, look, I believe governments should fund science, but they shouldn't fund scientists to develop specific things. They should fund them to understand nature, from which we will discover and be able to produce all kinds of new things. But don't hire me and then defund me because I couldn't build a gun that shoots that far, right? Because that's not how science works. This is part of this kind of idea that we have to obey nature. We have to be respectful to nature in the sense that, you know, if we're ever going to control it. because we can't make it do anything it won't do. We can't force the matter. Okay. Then he goes on to just comment. I'm going to go rather quickly here because we kind of have it all now. These are just quotations to really support and fill out a little bit of what we already know. The logic, of course, logic is part of the methodology, or the start of the method of science, right? The organon of Aristotle, the tool of knowledge, consisted of a part about induction, it did, and a part about the syllogism and logic. And he says the logic, the syllogism, now in use, though very properly applied to civil questions, so questions in politics and things like this, law, and the arts, which consist of discussion and opinion, still falls a long way short of the subtlety of nature. So he's thinking of like rhetoric as well. People who want to speak and convince people will use logic, right? Has a good use there. We say, if you believe X, Y, and Z, then you should believe T as well, right? Because logically they're connected together. That has a nice use there. But that's not how it is in science. This same method falls short of the subtlety of nature. Nature is too subtle for this, because you have to start with where you would say, well, you believe X, Y, and Z, therefore you think T. In the case of science, it would be X, Y, and Z are the fundamental concepts and principles of nature, therefore T. But we can't just figure out what those fundamental concepts of nature are without this huge investigation, right, involving induction. And so nature, the subtlety of nature is always more complicated and subtle than the human mind suspects. So one of the prejudices we'll see of the human mind is that it always assumes nature to be simpler than it is. And in grasping what it cannot hold, has succeeded in establishing and fixing errors rather than opening the way to truth. We saw this before. Because the first notions are corrupted, it establishes and fixes in the sense of makes permanent those errors, not as in correcting. That's not what he means there, right? Establishes and puts in place immovably those errors rather than opening the way to truth. So he goes on with his rhetoric. His plan is to lay the foundations not of a sect or of a dogma, not of a belief system, right? Not of something that's an authority, but of human progress and empowerment, right? Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to go forward. So that's the main preface, and now we get into the plan of the work. And here he reverts back to the image of sailing and exploring. So here, the plan of the work, this is the plan of the entire Great Instauration, right? The Great Renewal that he never finished. And so it has these different parts. First part, division of the sciences. This he did publish. It's kind of a very traditional thing. It's a rewriting of certain things in Aristotle. And he basically lays out all the different sciences and their titles and their functions and their various divisions, right? Including philosophy and metaphysics and politics and theology and natural history and so on and so forth, and physics and chemistry. And he tries to give, and this actually turned out probably to be his most popular book. It was often adopted as a textbook and taught at universities, like an introduction to knowledge, right? And it contained a thing called the tree of knowledge. We'll see Descartes will draw on that. The arbor, the tree of knowledge. Second, the new organon. And we have some aphorisms below from the new organon. This is the replacement of Aristotle's organon. It is the instrument. It is the discussion of methodology for Bacon, which includes all of the methods of studying and avoiding the prejudices, which he calls the idols. So he says this is called the new organon, or directions for the interpretation of nature. Bacon often distinguishes between the act of interpretation and the act of anticipation. And he says previous philosophy has been involved in science has been involved in the anticipation of nature. They tell nature what to be. They don't wait for nature to show what it is. What we should think of is like interpreting a text, like interpreting the Bible. That's how we should treat nature. Nature should be like interpretation. So we take it as given, and you can't interpret anything without a text. So that means experience comes first, right? But then you need rules of interpretation. And in this, he's kind of drawing on the biblical sciences at the time. So as you know now, especially if you are familiar with, as I'm sure all of you are, with Islam, there's a whole like apparatus of interpretation, right? Rules of interpretation. This is kind of part of the inspiration. Same thing was true in the Christian church, of course. And so he's kind of borrowing that model in a way. But instead of interpreting the religious text, we should be interpreting nature this way, with rules and giving as much attention to the text of nature as is given to the text of Aristotle, as to the text of the Bible, as to the text of the Quran, and so on. And
but
that's,
in
yeah.
an experiment, if you're setting a hypothesis, doesn't that count as anticipation of what's to happen?
Yeah, and this is, I would say, one of the great weaknesses of Bacon's, one of the limits of Bacon's understanding of science, is he understands that we should approach nature with questions, but not with hypotheses. The theoretical side, the creative, imaginative side of science is completely, for Bacon, it's part of the bad stuff, right? We stick to the experiences and what they tell us. The questions we have should come from other experiences. So even the question should be guided by our experiments. If this were the case, someone like Einstein would have never asked the questions he had, because not only was there no empirical evidence for what he was saying at the time, but there was no empirical reason to have that question. The question sprang from his discomfort with the structure of the theory in existence. So it's a purely theoretical, hypothetical kind of worry that led him to his questions and to his experiments. But for Bacon, just as Bacon gives almost very, he believes we should count things and we should measure things, but he does not believe in models. And of course, models are part of what we do, are the greater part of where our hypotheses come from, right? So he does not see science as progressing by hypotheses in this way. These are assumptions. You shouldn't make assumptions. Why would you make assumptions? Well, it turns out that we've kind of learned that empirical knowledge or experience doesn't mean much if you don't assume a lot of stuff about it already. It doesn't tell us very much. We have to kind of assume all kinds of things about it. And then maybe those assumptions get overturned later, but we can't do without them. We have to make kind of, not only the direct hypotheses we test, but also we have to assume a lot of things about nature that we've just not gotten to yet, or we could never start in the first place. So the second part, the third part, is the phenomena of the universe and natural and experimental history towards the foundation of philosophy. So this is like that collection of all knowledge about nature. It's like the project of the first like encyclopedia. Right? It would contain knowledge from the past, but all the knowledge that is found, the phenomena, this comes from the Greek word for what you see. So what's visible, what appears to you, the phenomena, what you see in the universe, a natural and experimental history towards the foundation of philosophy. Fourth, the ladder of the intellect. He didn't write this, and there's not a lot of knowledge about what it is, but the idea obviously is that by induction, we come to more and more general conclusions. slowly, but we do so over time. And that creates a kind of, just as when you go from the television set towards the knowledge of the components of the television to the electrons and so on, this is kind of like a ladder. This is what's here. It's this progress towards first principles undertaken and derived from the phenomena of the universe, our experiments and experience. Fifth, forerunners or anticipations of second philosophy. He never wrote this, and I myself am not even particularly clear what he intended here. First philosophy is usually metaphysics, right? And the basis of philosophy. But here he refers to second philosophy. Maybe what comes afterwards, I don't know. Sixth, second philosophy or practical science, all right? And this is where you finally come to the fruits, the practical results of things, and the impact that science should have on human practice, right? I suppose that's obviously what he's calling second philosophy, but what anticipations of that is, I'm not quite sure. Okay, so then he goes on to outline the parts, and as he outlines them, I said he returns to the image of sailing, right? So the first part, he says, gives a summary or a general description of the sciences. Hence, we shall not neglect to sail along the shores of the accepted sciences and arts, importing some useful items in them in our passage. So this, we're gonna sail through these 6 books. And the first one is, since we're looking through and charting everything, we're gonna sail along the coasts of all the known land and chart it out, right? That's the first part. Let's see what else. I'm gonna go a little faster here. So after coasting by the ancient arts, we will next, in the second part, equip the human understanding to set out on the ocean. So this is the new organon. This is the method is going to equip us. It's going to be like our navigation devices that will prepare us to go out on the ocean, right? We plan, therefore, for our second part to an account of a better and more perfect use of reason in the investigation of things and the true aids of the intellect, so that, despite our humanity and subjection to death, the human understanding may be raised and enlarged in its ability to overcome the difficult and dark things of nature. It is true that ordinary logic also claims to devise and prepare assistance and supports for the intellect, in which in this they are the same in their goal, but it differs altogether from ordinary logic in 3 particular ways. This is going to structure what comes next. In its end or goal, so the new logic, new methodology, new method differs from the old method in its end, in its order of demonstration, and in its starting points, the starting points of its inquiry. I think by now you should be able to tell me what he means by all of these. We shouldn't even, this tells you a little bit, it's a good test whether you start to understand an author well, is that you kind of already know what they're going to say, right? You can anticipate them instead of interpret them. Someone want to tell me what they think he's going to say here without looking forward? The new logic, his new method, differs from the end of the old logic. What is the end of the new logic? Someone tell me. End, goal, purpose.
Attaining all knowledge.
Oh, that's not the best answer.
The goal of the method is to arrive at first principles, right?
No. I mean, no. Hadi says, so Bacon wants us to experience things instead of taking what we already have as the rule. Yes, Hadi. What is the goal? It's the fruits. Are the fruits the first principles? No. I could see maybe that would be a misunderstanding. Maybe knowledge is the fruit. No, it's for human empowerment. All right, it's actual.
But
Go ahead.
the fruits of science, like, are the very last thing to arrive to. Logic doesn't directly lead us to the fruit. It leads us to making or reaching conclusions about the principles, which in turn lead to the inventions, right?
Now, I see why you say that, but think about it for a moment. It's not true, right? Any bit of knowledge I have can be useful. I don't need the first principles, right? If I know just a little bit about how plants grow, I can learn how to fertilize them and produce food. I don't need to understand it all the way down to the first principles before I can do that. So fruits come all the time from science at all its stages. But for Bacon, we may never reach the first principles. But this is why it doesn't matter so much, because the goal is not the first principles. The goal is the fruits that we get along the way. And it so happens that the deeper the principles are, the more universal they are, the more that they concern, and perhaps the greater the fruits you can get from them. But that's not necessarily the case, right? That depends on some of the first principles today. We get no fruits at all, right? Bacon would say, you're just wasting your time. Science, string theory, Bacon would say, this is not science anymore. There's no fruits to be had. What are you doing? You should be doing something else. So the way he sees science is not in terms of knowledge for knowledge's sake, because no knowledge for him is not this magical thing that gives us some kind of deep understanding of nature, right? It's the only thing it gives us is the ability to control nature. And so maybe you get so deep and so general that it's just practically useless. For Bacon, science shouldn't be interested in that. So there's another very different way in which Bacon thinks about it. So the end here is the discovery of arts. By arts, he means, basically arts means things that can be produced by human activity, right? That's what it means. It doesn't mean the fine arts or something like that. It's technology, craft, farming, medicine. These are the arts. The discovery of arts, not of arguments, of principles, and not of inferences from principles, of signs and indications of works, products, not of probable reasonings. So the goal is not knowledge itself. The goal is the power and control that you can get from that knowledge. Different results follow from our different design. They defeat and conquer our adversary by every adversary by disputation. We conquer nature by work, right? So the previous logic tries to defeat its adversaries by arguments. We defeat and conquer nature by work, by the hard work of investigating it, but also by the works. We show that we know by what we can do, right? So be quiet, we don't need to talk. My bomb is bigger than your bomb. I win, right? I clearly know more than you because I was able to do more than you. So that was the end. Okay, we tried and we somewhat failed, but that was a good test of our knowledge here, right? In the order of demonstration, this is a bit easier. What's the order of demonstration? What's he referring to here? It's okay. If you don't get it right, it's perfectly fine. How about, oh, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, does it have to do with how he goes from wholes to parts and from particulars to general rules?
Yeah, excellent. So it's this whole, the direction he takes, right, from experience to first principles instead of going from first principles to experience, or from wholes to parts, or effects to causes, and so on and so forth. This is a different path he's taking, and he'll explain it below, that the syllogism is that typical method that leads in the opposite direction to the order of things in his method, right? So he's going to talk about that. The order of our demonstrations agree with that end. For an ordinary logic, almost all effort is concentrated on the syllogism, which goes from principles to conclusions. The logicians seem scarcely to have thought about induction. They pass by it barely in a mention and hurry on to their formulae for disputation, for argument. But we reject proof by syllogism because it operates in confusion and lets nature slip out of our hands. And therefore, again, he says this, we reject the syllogism again, not only so far as principles are concerned, but also for intermediate propositions, which the syllogism admittedly deduces and generates in a certain fashion, but without effects and quite divorced from practice and completely irrelevant to the active parts of the sciences. For the nature of things, we use induction throughout, and as much for the minor propositions as for the major ones. For we regard induction as the form of demonstration which respects the senses, stays close to nature, fosters results, and is most involved in them itself. Right? So he says the order of demonstration is completely reversed. For the way the thing has normally been done until now is to leap immediately from sense and particulars to the most general propositions, right? So we spend no time with experience, and we leap immediately to the first principles. And from them by means of intermediate propositions, which is certainly a short route, but dangerously steep, inaccessible to nature and inherently prone to argument. By contrast, our method, axioms are gradually elicited step by step so that we reach the most general axioms at the very end, right? This is the inverse. And the
But
most
so
general axioms come out not
there
as,
is a notion,
yeah.
but then there is a notion of first principles to Bacon,
Yeah.
right? Because we said we move from experience to first principles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's okay.
So I said this before. It's like this path. Path has a beginning and an end. No matter which end you start at, it has a beginning and an end. It's the same path, right? But
So then so the end result or the goal is not the first principles, but the inventions. That's what we're saying, right?
yeah, the ultimate, yes. The ultimate goal is the end is not the end of the path of induction. Yeah. So a little bit of, I guess, subtlety there, but for science, no, and he thinks of science as including all of that. So the goal of science is the practice. And you can see this, it's a little bit, mostly by this fact that for him, it's not really important that we reach the first principles, but they do function as a kind of goal for the process of induction. Or we move from the particulars to the more general, right? And we need that kind of ideal point of that we're aiming at. But that doesn't mean that's the goal of that activity, of course. These general axioms, these are kind of general principles and concepts. It says we get these step by step, right? And the most general ones only at the very, very end. And we may never get them. And yet science would still exist and still be progressing and still be reaching its goals, right? You'll see that for other science, understandings of science, like in Descartes, if you don't have the first principles, you have no science at all. Like science doesn't start until you have the first principles. But for Bacon, science is something completely different. It's this larger process that aims at practice. But here, now notice in that, so he reverses everything, but he says, by far the biggest question we raise is the actual form of induction. So his main focal point is not induction, but the form of induction. How specifically, in a detailed way, how induction should be carried out. And of the judgment made on the basis of induction, how to draw judgments and conclusions from induction, the rules, again, for interpretation. For the form of induction which the logicians speak of, so he's admitting the logicians, the Aristotelians, speak of induction as well, right? Which proceed by simple enumeration. The apple falls, next apple falls, third apple falls, starting to suspect there's something that's going to make it such that all apples fall. Fourth apple falls. This is simple enumeration. To enumerate, it happened a lot of times, so it's probably going to happen in the future. This is what he says the old induction was like. Simple enumeration is a childish thing. It sounds like a childish thing, which jumps to conclusions because it sees one apple fall, two apples fall, and then it says all apples fall. Well, that's not a very good induction, is it? Maybe I should look at another tree. Maybe apples from other trees, when they fall off, they fly into the sky. Until I look, I shouldn't be saying all apples fall, right? I'm leaping from 12 apples to all, which is a potentially infinite number of things, right? It's all. And I'm saying from the fact that I saw 12 fall, that the next apple and all the apples afterwards must fall, because this is a general principle, right? He says this is childish, and it jumps to conclusions. It is exposed to the danger of instant contradiction, right? If you change the example, like 10 people walk into a room and you look in their pockets and they all have change in their pockets, and then you immediately jump to the conclusion that everyone who enters this room will have change in their pockets, there's a very good chance that the very next person that walks into the room is not going to have change in their pockets, right? It's open to this kind of induction is open to instant contradiction. Observes only familiar things and it reaches no results. Now, this too is a weakness of Bacon in a way. Philosophers have been talking about this for the last, I don't know, 60 years or so. It's been a big problem because sometimes we feel like we don't have to do very complicated induction. Like some of you, when I said that about apples, you probably thought to yourself, I'm not so sure. Maybe 12 apples is enough. Maybe 3 apples is enough. How many experiments do we really have to do? And how complex do those experiments have to be before we think that what happens follows a general rule? Well, it turns out in science today, sometimes we feel okay with just one experiment. I mean, people have to be able to repeat that experiment, right? But that's not about whether the experiment establishes the truth or not. It's about whether we carried out the experiment properly, right? So we often think today that even one experiment, we find one example of this, and it truly is an example. We find one gravitational wave, then there are gravitational waves. We don't need to find 12 of them or 16 of them. You say, but you object, and you say, but they have to be able to reproduce the experiment and so on. Yes, but that's just to show that the instruments were properly calibrated and so on, and that the evidence that we found is not an artifact of our own activity. But if we accept that that really is the data, then we often take one example as sufficient to establish that, if it is the true data. Yeah.
Does this have to do with the idea that theories are plausible as long as until they're falsified? Like we consider them to be true even though we're not 100% sure that they're...
No, that's not why we do it. I think you're referring to Karl Popper's falsification theory, but that's not quite his idea, and that's not why I think we do it. I think the way we do it is because something that Bacon didn't anticipate is we have very complex mathematical models of nature in which a single result has a great consequence. Right? We can say that if our theory is, if this is how electromagnetism works, then in general, then this thing has to happen in this way. And if it doesn't even happen in that way in one case, then the whole theory has to change, right? And so it's we already work with general theories. We don't elicit them all from experience. And we then take data in as giving us evidence about those specific theories. And because they're part of the theories, or they give evidence on general theories, they give general evidence. So that's how we think about it in a way that, and we just assume that nature has general principles, that one thing doesn't operate in one way for one reason and a similar thing in a different way. It's part of our vision of nature that, okay, Safa, that when an apple falls, it falls not because it's an apple, not because it's red, and not because it's on this tree or whatever, but it falls because of some more general property that it has, like mass or something like that. Okay, I guess we're definitely out of time, and I have to get prepared for my next class. So anticipate an email from me about Thursday. I'm not sure exactly how we'll do. I think I might take us through the rest of this in a video and finish up Bacon. That's probably what I'll end up doing. Okay, I'll see you all soon. What?
Professor?
Yeah?
I think Thursday holiday, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Thursday, I think it's holiday.
Oh, Thursday's a holiday.
Yeah.
Ah. Okay. So I will probably assign something video oriented, so we don't have to make up that holiday, right? That's probably
Yes.
what I'll do. Okay. I'll see you all next week then, I guess.
Sorry, Professor.
Yeah?
I haven't been receiving your emails of the links for class. I don't know why. I've been having to get them from classmates.
Okay. Let's,
Should I give them?
everybody else, you can go ahead and leave. Let me see. This is section 2. What's your email address?
AGW02. Oh, there it is.
Do you see it?
Yeah. I don't know why they're not maybe they're going to junk.
Yeah. Do you have your email open there? You could.
No. Oh my God, Professor, I'm so sorry. They've been going to junk for some reason. They're literally all on junk.
Well, you might want to undo that. I don't know why.
Yeah.
AUB is a little bit bad about this.
Because I've been receiving your other emails about assignments, but I haven't been receiving class links. But it's okay, I'll fix it right now.
Okay, well, now we figured it out.
Sorry, my bad.
No problem.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Have a nice day.
You too.